thank you all for taking time out of your Monday morning to listen to this. What I'm going to tell you about today is a project that I'm doing with my colleague and co-founder Andrew Ng, trying to use technology to basically make education more accessible to everyone around the world. So there is a number of global forces that have been driving us towards a crisis point, I think, in higher education, which are leading to the inflection point that anyone who's been reading the recent media coverage, I think, recognizes that is upon us. As my Stanford president, John Hennessy, said recently, there's a tsunami coming in higher education. And so this is part of what I'll tell you about today. So what are some of these global forces? The first is just the lack of availability of higher education in large parts of the world. And one example of that, which I consider to be particularly poignant, is a recent event that happened in South Africa. So the system in South Africa was constructed back in the days of apartheid for the white minority. And as a consequence, there just aren't enough positions in the top public universities for the many people who want and deserve a higher education. And I think that the admissions rate for a lot of these universities is about 1 in 8. Number of applicants to number of people admitted. So this led to a tragedy in the University of Johannesburg earlier this year that some of you might have heard of. There were a handful of slots left open from the standard admissions process. And so the day before they were going to open that up for general admissions, there was a line of people over a mile long lined up outside the gates for the whole night, trying to be first in line to get one of those slots. And then when the gates opened in the morning, there was a stampede and 20 people were injured and 1 woman died. She was the mother of a son and she was trying to give him the chance at a better life. Now that's a particularly tragic event and maybe is not something that we see every day, but it really does highlight the importance and the implications of the scarcity in many parts of the developing world. Even in parts of the world where education is available, it might not be within reach for everyone. And so the data that I have is from the United States, but after talking yesterday with Andrew and Jonathan, I realized that similar issues are also coming up here in the UK. So in the United States, for example, there's been a significant amount of discussion on the rising costs of medical care, and indeed that's been going up very quickly. What hasn't been recognized until recently is that during the same period from 1985 onwards, college tuition and fees have been increasing at almost twice the rate. So from 1985 until today, there's been an increase of 559% in college tuitions. And I know that affordability is coming up as an issue for the UK as well. Now, this, of course, makes education unaffordable for many in the United States, and there's been a tremendous amount of coverage recently on the increasing amount of student debt, on the fact that certain students are just deciding to skip academic college altogether and instead go to something like beauty school or some other vocational training because they can get that done in a year much more affordably. And so this is something that I think is causing another significant crisis in higher education. And then finally, even for students who get a higher education, the doors of opportunity might not open for them. So in the United States, among recent college graduates, only a little bit over half the students are working in jobs that require a higher education. The rest are either unemployed or working in jobs where the education is not beneficial to them. Now, this, of course, is not true for students who graduate from top institutions. But for the ones who graduated from the long tail of academic institutions, this is a real problem. They're not getting the benefit for their effort and their money. So what can we do? Tom Friedman wrote in a recent article that he wrote about our effort, I think, put it better than anyone, and I just really love this quote. He said that big breakthroughs are what happens when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. And so what's desperately necessary, I've just talked about. What's suddenly possible? So what was suddenly possible was demonstrated in the big Stanford classes that launched in the fall of 2011, and I think many of you have seen that coverage. There were 3 classes that Stanford offered to the general public for free, and they each had an enrollment of 100,000 students or more. So to put that number in perspective, my colleague Andrew teaches one of the bigger Stanford courses. It has an enrollment of 400 students every time it's offered. This is a machine learning class. Andrew's machine learning class, when he offered it to the general public, had an enrollment of 100,000 students. So in order for Andrew to reach that same size audience, he would have to teach his Stanford class for 250 years. So that really clarifies, I think, the range of impact that this can have. So when Andrew and I saw this, we started to think, okay, how can we make this broader? How can we teach more students in more subjects? And so what we decided is to form this entity called Coursera, which is trying to offer education at scale. So to offer education from the best instructors at the best universities across a range of disciplines to everyone around the world for free. So currently we have 43 courses from 4 universities on the platform. We're working currently with Princeton, Stanford University of Pennsylvania, and University of Michigan. And there's a number of other universities that are coming on board in a very short time frame of comparable quality. So let me show you what some of our courses look like.
Welcome to Calculus. 50 million people are uninsured. Models help us organize information. They help us make better predictions. They help us design more effective institutions and policies. And if we run this, we get unbelievable segregation.
So Bush imagined that in the future, you'd wear a camera right in the center of your head.
Mills wants the student of sociology to develop the quality of mind that grasps the interplay.
Hanging cable takes on the form of a hyperbolic cosine.
For each pixel in the image, set the red to 0. So let's see what that looks like.
And that vaccine allowed us to eliminate poliovirus.
Does Lufthansa serve breakfast in San Jose? Well, that sounds funny.
So this is which coin you pick. This is the 2 tosses.
0 from being passive, so passive becomes a best response.
So in large-scale machine learning, we'd like to come up with computational.
So we launched this enterprise. We started doing this in January. We launched our first courses in February. We announced who we were in April. Since then, we have 650,000 students. This slide is a bit out of date because I made it a week ago, from 190 countries. We have 1.5 million enrollments. In the 15 or so classes that have launched so far, we've had 6 million quizzes submitted and 14 million video views, illustrating, I guess, that students like getting high-quality content for free. But it's not just about the numbers, it's also about the people. And one of the things that's really touching us is the emails that we get from people and the forum posts of individual people talking about the way in which this has completely changed their lives. So this, for example, is Akash, who comes from a middle-class family in a very small town in India and would never have had access to, say, a Stanford quality education, and wrote to us to talk about how this has changed his life by giving him access to this kind of education. This is Jenny, whose picture you can't see because the projector is awfully dark, but she's a single mom of 2 teenage boys and wanted to hone her skills so she can go back to school and get her master's degree and get a better job. And then this one is Ryan. You can see him over there with his baby daughter. She was diagnosed with an immune disease and he couldn't leave the house because it would be too much of a risk to bring germs into the house. And so he took the classes online from within his house, and then he wrote to us later saying that the story had a really happy ending, because you can see baby Shannon on the left there, she's doing a lot better. And he ended up getting a job by virtue of taking some of these online classes. So it was a really heartwarming story. So what does it take to offer a real education at scale? Now, you might say online course content has been available for a while. There's been MIT's OpenCourseWare. There's been a whole range of open materials. What makes this so different? What made this so different is this was a real course. It wasn't just passive content. So the course started on a given day, and then students went through it watching videos and submitting real homeworks with real grades and real deadlines. You can see the deadlines. They're the spikes in the usage graph, which demonstrates that procrastination is a universal phenomenon. And at the end of the course, the students got some kind of certificate. It wasn't an official certificate. It didn't give college credit, but it was useful to them nevertheless. We've been told by students that they presented that certificate to employers and it got them a better job. We've even heard of cases where students presented that certificate to a college in which they were enrolled and got college credit for taking our courses. This is especially true for the many colleges that can't offer the level of curriculum that the universities that we're working with can offer. And so this gave them an opportunity to enrich the curriculum for their students and give them a broader range of opportunities upon graduation. So what are some of the key components? The first is that video actually gives you a much richer medium in many ways when designing course than a lecture-based class when you have 300 people sitting in a dark auditorium watching the instructor. It gives the students much more control over their own learning experience. So here you can see students watching a double 1.5x.
Starting point. And then we have to decide what are their strategies.
With subtitles.
Player can take. Is passive and active enough of a distinction?
In different languages.
The details of what's going on in a predator-prey relationship. Well, probably not.
So the students can have a lot more control over their learning experience. They can watch quickly in the parts that they understand well. If they find that they're not understanding, they can stop, they can rewind, they can listen again. They have the ability to watch with subtitles, which is really important for students with hearing and learning disabilities. If you can watch with subtitles in different languages, which makes the content more accessible for foreign language speakers. So it's a much more universal learning experience than a standard lecture-based class. The other aspect of this is that if you move away from the constraints, from the logistical constraints of classroom scheduling and student scheduling, you can make the learning experience much more flexible in other ways. So why have a monolithic 1-hour lecture? Instead, you can break up the content into short chunks, each of which represents a coherent concept. The chunks are 8, maybe 12 minutes. They can be strung together in different ways depending on the student's background, skills, and interests. So some students, for example, might need background material for preparation that other students don't, and they have the option of watching it without forcing all of their peers to wait for that content. Other students might be interested in particular extension topics that aren't necessarily relevant to the entire class. And so this allows the students to move away, allows us to move away from the one-size-fits-all model of education that has been forced on us by the need to scale education by lecturing to 150 students at a time. Okay, the second, and I think more important piece of this, is the integration of formative assessments into every single part of the learning experience of the students. Because there's been a range of studies, of which the one I'm about to show you is just one, demonstrating that interaction, constant interaction, testing, retrieval of the material is really fundamental to learning outcomes. So this is a paper that appeared in Science in 2011. It's part of a series, and it demonstrates student performance on a downstream assessment if they just studied, if they studied and restudied, reviewed the material, or if they did retrieval practice, which means they were asked really simple questions saying, what did you just learn? And the students who had that retrieval practice did much better on the downstream exam than any other learning intervention that was tested, these as well as several others. So we've tried to build that into the platform in many different places. So first of all, the videos themselves are not passive experiences. Students don't just sit there and watch the videos. The video, every few minutes, pauses and the students get asked a question. We used to ask such a question every 8 minutes in the video. Now we're asking it every 4 to 5 because students kept telling us that they wanted more of those questions. So here's what that looks like.
These 4 things: prospect theory, hyperbolic discounting, status quo bias, base rate bias. They're all well documented. So they're all well documented deviations from rational behavior.
So the video pauses and the student is forced to answer a question, did you understand what I just told you? And in this case, they didn't, so they have a chance to try again. They submit, they get immediate feedback, and they have an optional explanation as well. So this is a way for students to register their own learning and are they understanding the material or not with this kind of immediate feedback loop. Now, this is the kind of simple question that I, as an instructor, might ask when I teach in class. But when I do that in class, there is 80% of the students who are still busy scribbling the last thing I said. There's the 15% in the back row who are just zoned out on Facebook. And then, I'm sure you have those too. And then in the front row, there is the smarty pants who blurts out the answer before anyone else has had a chance to think about it. And then I, as the instructor, am so pleased that someone actually knew the answer to my question. And then the lecture moves on before most of the students have even registered the fact that a question had been asked. Here, every student is forced to engage with the material, providing much better learning outcomes. Now, of course, this is not just about multiple choice and, this is not just about simple assessments within the video. Every week, the students are given deep and, we hope, rigorous assessments to test their knowledge. So what kinds of assessments can we actually grade at scale? Because one of the things that you have to deal with here is if you have 100,000 students and you don't have 5,000 teaching assistants or tutors, how are you going to do this? So obviously, you can grade multiple choice at scale. But you can also grade other things. Numerical answers, that's pretty straightforward. The kinds of short answer questions that you saw in the video that I just showed, we can grade simple, 3, 4, 5 word phrases that allow for a certain amount of variability, so it's not just an exact match. So those are things that we can grade at scale. These are the fairly straightforward ones. The ones that are not quite as straightforward, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of them, is grading of math, grading of programming and modeling assignments, and grading of open-ended work using a process called peer assessment or peer grading. So here is the math stuff. Actually, before I go into this, let me say that we also just can grade mathematical expressions. So the student can enter in an expression such as a squared plus b over 2, and we will be able to grade that automatically, even if there's variability in how the answer is written. But this is a more interesting capability. It's currently in alpha mode on the site, so it's not quite operational yet. But the person who developed this actually is a collaboration with a Stanford colleague, Alex Aiken. Colleen Lee just joined us as an engineer. She deferred graduate school for a year so that she could build this into the platform and offer it to all courses. This is grading of free-form mathematical derivations. So imagine that you need to take a derivative of a complicated function like the one that's shown up there at the top. That's usually something that requires 5 or 6 steps. And often students get lost and they make a mistake somewhere along the way. What we have is a system that allows the instructor to stipulate the rules that can be allowed in doing this kind of exercise. For example, the chain rule for derivatives or various other simple rules. And then the student enters in free-form math in much the same way as they would write on paper, step by step, the mathematical derivation. And the system checks each step whether it's justified by one of the rules that the instructor said were okay to use. So if they're going in a wrong direction and are trying to apply an incorrect step, the system will tell them that, preventing them from submitting an answer that's wrong. Now, this is really an incredibly valuable feedback to the students, because when we do this in traditional homeworks, the students write down the derivation on paper, they submit it, they get the feedback maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, and then at that point they never go back and understand that this was wrong and why it was wrong, and so this is not a useful learning experience for them if they didn't get it right the first time. And so this is really a much more valuable way of teaching students how to do mathematical derivations. The second piece that we can do a lot of auto-grading for is structured output. Now, structured output encompasses a range of different types of things. The first is programming assignments. We grade effectively programming assignments in a whole range of languages, R, Python, MATLAB, Java, JavaScript, a whole bunch of others. Now, you can grade on correctness by basically checking that the student's program produces an equivalent output to what the instructor's program produces, but you can also do more advanced assessments that are performance-based. So, for example, you can test timing, memory use. You can also check real performance criteria. So, for example, in my class, one of the assignments was a spell checking and correction assignments, and students were graded based on how many mistakes they correctly caught and correctly corrected. And so that's a performance-based criterion. Now, programming assignments aren't just for computer scientists. A lot of the kinds of models that are constructed, for example, by various types of engineers and in the physical sciences are also little baby programs in a language such as R or MATLAB that represent, for example, the behavior of a physical circuit or the behavior of a bridge when subjected to stresses such as wind shear. You can have students construct a model of that physical system and have the system check whether that model is correct, effectively grading them not on their programming ability, but on their understanding of the system that they're trying to model. And then finally, Excel spreadsheets are also a form of structured outputs, which allows us to grade things like data analysis on the one hand, as well as in the context of business classes, financial models, marketing models, and other things. So let me show you one example of that. This is a programming assignment in Stanford's Computer Science 101 class. The student is supposed to color correct the image on the right. They're doing programming in the browser. They get immediate feedback, both visual and text, that this isn't quite right. So they get, again, a chance to revise, resubmit, and now they're told that their output is correct. So they get immediate feedback on their performance in this assignment. And we have that across a range of different programming languages. OK, the last piece of this is the ability to grade the kind of open-ended work that is so critical in disciplines such as the humanities and the social sciences, but is also relevant in business, in medicine, and in a variety of other disciplines as well. So when we tried to convince the faculty members, for example, in humanities, that you could be really creative with multiple choice, they didn't really buy that. And so we had to come up with something else. And what we ended up using is a pipeline an idea called peer grading, where students critically grade each other's work. Because again, you can't have the TAs grade 100,000 essay questions. So this is a paper by Sadler and Good from 2006 that demonstrates that peer grading, if constructed well, actually works. And so what you have here on the x-axis is the teacher grade, on the y-axis in this case is the peer grade, and you can see that there is a very nice correlation between them so that the student assigned grades are actually a reliable estimate of what the teacher assigned grades are. Now, what's equally interesting, or maybe even more interesting, is that if students are appropriately incentivized to critically assess their own work, the correlation is even better. So of course, you have to prevent them somehow from just giving themselves full marks all the time. But once you do that, you get an even better correlation with teacher-assigned grades. Now, the Sadler and Good paper also shows, I didn't put that on the slides, that these are actually also valuable learning exercises for the students. That is, students who engage in peer grading, and even more so ones who engage in self-grading, actually have better learning outcomes down the line because they learn what's right and what's wrong and how to think critically about their own work and other people's work. So we put together the largest peer grading pipeline ever constructed. It accommodates thousands, tens of thousands of students. And there is a complicated process that tries to make sure that the peer grades are actually reliable. So here's what happens. Over here, you can see the second dotted line is the submission deadline, where everyone gets to submit their work. When the work is submitted, students are provided with a grading rubric that the instructor put together. And we've now accumulated a fair bit of expertise and are continually refining what makes for a grading rubric that can be applied by naive students at scale. And so the instructor provides the grading rubric, the students are given that rubric, and then they are put through, optionally, but it tends to improve the results, a little mini teaching assistant boot camp where they are given a small number of assignments that the instructor has previously graded, and they're supposed to grade those without knowing what the instructor grades are. And if their grades are consistent with the instructor grades, then they're considered competent and can go grade the work of their peers. And then we have each student grade about 5 of their peers' work. This is completely randomized and anonymous, so prevents cheating and collusion and stuff like that. When you have a class of 30,000 students, it's actually hard to collude. I mean, you don't know most of your classmates. So, and then the students provide both quantitative and qualitative feedback. The quantitative feedback is aggregated using a robust averaging procedure, and what students get is a combination of both qualitative and quantitative scores. There is an optional self-grading phase. You can see that under the number 4. And then there is various other cool things that might be nice to add. For example, a gallery of the top graded submissions demonstrating to students what really good work can look like, things like that. So that's the pipeline, and it's completely automated. The whole thing is completely automated. Once the grading rubric is constructed and the sample graded homeworks are graded by the instructor needs no further involvement in any of this grading process, which allows us to do at-scale grading for the kind of open-ended work that I mentioned earlier. Okay. The third big piece of this is that this isn't just a student sitting alone in their living room watching videos and doing homework. There is a community that developed around each and every one of our courses of people sort of mutually engaged in an intellectual endeavor. So this, for example, is a self-assembled map the students just decided to put together in our Sociology 101 class from Princeton. You can see that it really spans the world. This is only a small subset of the students. It was a particular time point when a snapshot that we took the map from. But you can see that it really does span the world. As I said, we have 190 countries. Now, students interacted with each other in many different ways. The first is via our question and answer forum. So it's actually not that easy to design a question and answer forum that works effectively for thousands of students. If you have 50 students in a class, any question and answer forum would work. But if you have 10,000 or 50,000 students in class, and each one of them asks even one question, you're basically toast. I mean, it just doesn't work. So we ended up putting in a lot of UI pieces that allow this to be done, to be effective for a class of this size. The first is you can see the votes on the left. Students vote up questions and also vote up answers. So the most useful questions bubble to the top, as do the most useful answers. And then there's a long tail of not so useful questions that most people never see. The other thing that's not shown on the slide is automatic detection of duplicate questions or related questions. So the student, when they type in their question, the system automatically pulls up questions that are similar to the one that the student is trying to ask. And so that if somebody else has already asked that question and it's been answered, the student doesn't ever enter the question into the system, which reduces question fragmentation and duplication by an order of magnitude or two, which is absolutely essential to the usability of this by thousands of students. So this was a remarkably effective strategy for especially some of our harder technical classes, because a student would ask a question even at 3 o'clock in the morning, and somewhere around the world there would be another student working on the same topic who would basically come in and try and help them. So the median response time in our fall quarter classes for a question asked on the Q&A forum was 22 minutes, which is not a level of service that I've ever offered to my Stanford students. And basically, we got testimonials from students like this that say this was, in fact, a more collaborative experience with more interaction than they got when they took a physical class, because interaction was so much a central part of the experience. In addition to that, organically, we had study groups forming. Initially, this wasn't something that we built into the platform. Now we're trying to build that in more deeply. But students just posted on the forum, here I am, I'm in Athens, who wants to form a study group with me? And we had physical study groups based on geographical constraints. We had a very large London study group for several of our classes, for example. And some of these were virtual study groups based on language lines, for example, Arabic or Russian-speaking students, social or cultural lines, as well as you can see at the bottom left there, the multilingual universal study group, which is people who explicitly wanted to connect with people from other cultures. And so that really gave a tremendous opportunity for people to have this be a social experience, which is important for keeping students retained and engaged and learning better. Okay, so what are some of the opportunities that this kind of system can produce? The first is that it really provides us with the opportunity to obtain a completely different look at the process of human learning. Because the data that we can collect here, that we do collect here, is unprecedented in both its scale and its level of detail. We collect every click, every homework submission, every forum post by tens of thousands of students. So this gives us the ability to turn the study of human learning from the hypothesis-driven mode, which is what it's been mostly so far, to the data-driven mode, which has really revolutionized so many other disciplines, such as biology, for example. We can get insights at the global level. What are some learning strategies that work versus learning strategies that don't? As well as at the local level. For a given course, what's not working? What are people not getting, and how can we fix that? So here's an example of that from Andrew's machine learning class again. This is a distribution of wrong answers to one of the programming assignments. The answers happen to be pairs of numbers, which is why we can graph them on this two-dimensional plot. Each little x is a different wrong answer. Now you can see that some of the x's are small, representing one-off answers where students just had their own particular misunderstanding. But for example, that big x at the top left is where 2,000 students had the exact same wrong answer. Now, if you have 2 students in a class of 100 that have the exact same wrong answer, you'd never notice. But when you have 2,000 students, it kind of jumps out at you. And so Andrew and his DAs went in and looked at that assignment and understood the misconception that lay at the root of it. And then they constructed a targeted error message so that any other student whose answer fell into that particular bucket would get that targeted error message as opposed to just the "you're wrong." And that gave a much more personalized and useful experience to the students because it put them on the right track in terms of what they needed to fix in order to get the right answer. And so this effectively is a much more personalized experience that you can do by utilizing this large amount of data that we have. So here's another kind of question that you can ask that is an analysis that we did recently. Let's say a student, you saw that there is multiple opportunities for students to resubmit the same work as part of the formative assessments. So when a student submits an incorrect answer and then come back a half hour, an hour later and submit the right answer, what did they do in the middle? What helped them go from the wrong answer to the right answer? Did they watch a video? Did they, and which video? Did they look at the Q&A forum? Did they post on the Q&A forum? I mean, there's all sorts of things they could have done. So here we looked, for example, at forum posts. And which forum posts did the students look at that most helped them move from an incorrect to a correct submission? And it turned out that if you look at the most helpful forum posts, it's exactly the one that hammers in on the most common misconception of that particular assignment. And so that allows you to tailor the experience on either the student side or the instructor side. On the instructor side, you can go and tell the instructor, you might want to explain this more clearly next time because this is something that a lot of students didn't get, and this is the explanation that helped them get it. Or you can build this on the student side by seeing that a student is struggling with this particular question. You can send them to look at this forum post, again, helping them streamline their learning experience and making it more effective. So this personalization is one of the, I think, biggest opportunities in this whole line of work because it allows us to solve what is a 30-year-old open problem that was posed by Benjamin Bloom in 1984. Benjamin Bloom is a renowned educational researcher who studied 3 populations. The first is a population of students who were taught in a traditional lecture-based classroom. And here you see the distribution of the achievement scores. The second population is students who were taught in a lecture-based format, but using a mastery learning approach, which means that they were not allowed to move on to the second topic before they had mastered the first one, thereby providing them a much better basis for the next topic down the line. And the third population was those students fortunate enough to have access to an individual human tutor. Now you can see that the red distribution is a full standard deviation, or sigma, above the blue distribution, the lecture-based distribution. And the individual tutoring is 2 standard deviations, or 2 sigma, above that lecture-based distribution. So to clarify the implications of that, let's look at the lecture-based population and let's pick the median performance as a threshold so that in the lecture-based class, half the students are above and half the students are below that threshold. Using that exact same threshold in the individual tutoring population, 98% of the students are above that threshold. Colloquially, you could say that 98% of the students are above average in that population. Now, that would be really cool if we could do that. But we can't, hence the 2 sigma problem. Because as a society, we can't afford to provide an individual human tutor to every single student. But we can afford to provide maybe a computer or at least a smartphone to every student. And so the question is, can technology allow us to move from the blue curve to the green curve? Now, the red curve is actually not that difficult. We've already seen mastery in action as part of this online learning experience because students can watch the same video 5 times, and they can do it even without being embarrassed because nobody would ever know. And the computer also doesn't get tired of grading the same work for the third time and the fourth time. And so, again, students have the opportunity to really achieve mastery in cases where, using the standard manual grading capabilities that is what we have so far, nobody would be willing to grade their work multiple times. You just don't have the resources to do that. So the red curve, I think, the standard the 1 sigma, is achievable. And we've now started to think about how do we move towards the green curve in terms of personalization. Now that's a bit of a harder goal. I mean, I don't know that we can achieve the quality of an individual human tutor, but we've seen personalization both in the ability to go through different trajectories in the curriculum and in some of the personalized feedback that students are getting by having feedback that's specific to the kinds of mistakes that they're making. So I don't know if we can get all the way to the green curve, but we're trying to push in that direction. Okay, so for those of us who are traditional educators, the question that immediately comes up after having seen this is, if this online learning is so great, are universities going to become obsolete? So Mark Twain actually thought so. He said that college is a place where a professor's lecture notes go straight to the student's lecture notes without passing through the brains of either. I actually have a different interpretation, though, of the Mark Twain quote, which is that this isn't about college education. It's about the ubiquitous use of one-direction lecturing in college education that is such a big part of the current college experience. And so maybe what we ought to do with that precious time that students actually come and attend a physical institution is something different. So going back even further to Plutarch, who said that the mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting. And maybe what we should be doing with our classroom time is igniting our students' minds, their imaginations, their creativity, and their problem-solving skills. So what's one way of doing that? Again, going back to a whole range of studies, of which this is just one, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Carl Wyman, in a paper in Science also last year, studied two populations. This is a very large study. It had 208, relatively speaking, 280 students in each of two populations. One that attended a traditional lecture with an award-winning instructor, and one that did active learning in the classroom with a bunch of teaching assistants. And you can see that in this study, as well as many others that Wyman has participated in, you see improved metrics in improved performance in every single metric, in attendance, in engagement, and in learning as measured by a standardized test at the end of the unit. And for example, on the learning outcome, scores on the test nearly double between the active learning and the traditional lecturing. So maybe this is what we ought to spend a lot more of our time doing. So what did I do? So I did this in my class. I've been doing this for about 4 years now. And here's some of the things that you can do as part of this active learning paradigm. First of all, because the quiz results are available immediately, because of the grading at scale, we can do just-in-time teaching. So when I walk into class, I spend the first 20 minutes or so going over the misconceptions for those problems that the students got wrong in the last week. So if I assign 10 questions and pretty much people nailed 8 of them, I only spend time on the 2, not on the 8. Then we can do some of the stuff that we never have time for, like higher level discussion of the material. How do different pieces fit together? How do we think about this approach versus that approach? I had guest lecturers come in and present real-world applications of this academic material, which serves both to motivate students as well as to illustrate to them what are some of the constraints that one has to deal with when the rubber meets the road. That is, you can't necessarily do things in the completely pure academic way that you studied in class. What are some of the trade-offs you have to make in order to get this to work in practice? We did a lot of the interactive problem solving in small teams along the lines of what Wyman did in the study that I just showed you, where I would pose a question, students would assemble into small teams, they would think about how to answer that question, and then I and the TAs would walk around giving students feedback about you're on the right track, or you might want to think about this, and then after about 15 minutes we would all come together again and discuss different solutions, pros and cons, and so on and so forth. Now, when I did this, I deliberately didn't want to increase the scope of the material. So I told students that I wouldn't be teaching any new material in these sessions that was not covered in the video lectures. So they didn't have to come if they didn't want to. Now, furthermore, because of the fact that Stanford does distance learning for industry students in Silicon Valley, all of my classes before and these have always been televised. So people said, you know, these are optional and televised. You're not going to have anybody showing up by the end of week 3. Why would people bother? And it turned out to be false. Whereas traditional attendance in televised classes at Stanford, including mine, is about 30% by the middle of the course because people get busy and they have projects due and so on and so forth, and they don't bother coming to class because they can watch it in their dorm room at 2 o'clock in the morning. So whereas my attendance had typically been 30% of enrollment, here it's steady stated at about 70% of enrollment, so about double what I'd had before. So students actually saw the value of coming to class in person to engage in these activities. There are, I think, significant benefits to this online format, even with on-campus teaching, even just to our own on-campus population. I think the interaction is with the immediate feedback that's so beneficial to public students is beneficial here as well. The tailoring of the flow and the pace through the content. This is one that's maybe not quite as obvious until you start thinking about this. In many academic institutions in the US, and I'm guessing in the UK as well, not every student comes in with an equivalent level of background. Some students come in from a less advantaged high school that haven't had as many of the prerequisite courses, for example. These students often sit in the back feeling like they can't ask a question because they're going to be perceived as stupid. They're going, or at least, I mean, that's the way they feel. And they keep falling further and further behind, and often they just drop out. Because of the anonymity of this online format, students are much more willing to ask questions on the forum, to watch the same video multiple times until they get it. And so it gives them the opportunity to build up both their skills and their confidence before they have to go back into the much more threatening in-class format. Talked about analytics and the meaningful engagement. And then I guess the last piece of this is, we've talked about the sea change, the disruption, if you will, that's coming up in higher education. And I think one of the things that we at academic institutions need to think is, what is the value that we offer to our students? Because increasingly it's not going to be the content, because the content is largely already available and will become more available over time. And so what is it that we offer our students that's different from just sitting there and watching lectures? One obvious answer is accreditation, and that's important. But I think we should be able to offer our students more than just accreditation and content. There needs to be something that makes value, that has value for being in a physical environment where you can have these kind of serendipitous interactions with your peers and with your instructors. And so that's, I think, where we really need to think about what universities offer to students. Okay, so this is my big vision slide at the end. If we could really make education accessible to everyone around the world for free, what might some of those consequences be? This is the utopian vision slide. First of all, it would make education a basic human right, so that anyone around the world who had the skills and the perseverance would be able to go in and learn something that they could use to make a better life for themselves and their families and their communities. Second, it would enable lifelong learning for all of us. Because for many of us, maybe not those of us in this room, but for many others, learning stops when we finish high school or when we finish college. And by having this wealth of high-quality content available for free with this really engaging learning experience, it means that if somebody wanted to learn something, whether it's just to expand their minds or to change their lives, that opportunity would be open to them. And then the last piece of this is that this could really open the door to what might be called a wave or a tsunami of innovation, because talent can be found everywhere. And maybe the next Albert Einstein or the next Steve Jobs is living in one of those remote villages in Africa. And if you could offer them this kind of high-quality education, they would be able to live up to their potential and come up with the next big idea that could make the world a better place for all of us. Thank you.